Hi everybody, welcome back to Divorce Workshop, Insights in Divorce. Live today, today we're going to be talking to Geneece, Reverend Geneece again. I'm just going to get her on. I also want to mention that if any of you know that our workbook is available on just go to our webpage, www.divorceworkshop.ca. Good morning, Geneece.
Good morning.
Nice to
How
have
are
you.
you?
Nice to have you back again
Thank you. Thank you.
on this very important topic. First of all, just do another quick bio for anybody that is on or who'll see this later.
Yeah. My name is Geneece, also known as Reverend Jen. Just it's easier with first and last name that's hard to spell or pronounce. Um, I am a survivor of more than 2 decades of domestic violence that actually was broken into 2 abusive marriages, one that lasted 2 years, one that lasted 22 years. The second one looking very different from the first, which is why it was so hard to recognize and understand what I was living with for so long. Also, there was a lot of shame and guilt
Mhm.
from that first divorce, perpetuated in part, or I would say in large part, by the church, which is the topic that we're going to get into today. It's really hard to heal from something when you are villainized by
Mm,
a community, right? So I felt so much pressure to stay in that marriage. Of course, when you have a number of kids coming in that marriage, that increases your desire to try to make things work, try to be a stable environment for the kids. Um, but it just continued to get worse until the kids and I were able to escape about a decade ago. And I went back to school because I believed I had this call on my life to advocate for other victims and survivors. And a lot of the work that I've done since going back to graduate school has been at the intersection of faith and domestic
mhm.
violence. So I went to seminary. I'm also a licensed master social worker, currently working on a PhD in social work. And my dissertation research, again, is around this topic of the intersection of faith and domestic violence.
Do you think it is talked about enough?
Absolutely not.
Mhm.
I think the church has this odd vested interest in making sure that marriages stick together no matter what happens. Particularly, you saw this through the 80s and 90s where like divorce was villainized. We wanted to keep everyone together. It didn't matter if you were experiencing domestic violence. Nobody talked about domestic violence because it was just your fault, right?
Mhm.
You weren't trying hard enough. You weren't submissive enough. You weren't praying enough. You weren't the right kind of, believer, whatever your faith system is. So I think it was just perpetuated that it's the victim's fault. You got to stay in it. Therefore, if we talk about it at all, that's how we talk about it.
Is that because of the vows we say, the scriptures you read, these deep values that, you've proclaimed to God that you will stay together till death do you part? Does that have anything to do with that?
I think that's part of it. I think that we'll talk about spiritual abuse more, I
Mm-hmm.
think, as we go on, but there's that spiritual abuse component, not just from your spouse, but also from the
Mm-hmm.
church. And so they are kind of heaping on that guilt and shame, like, well, you said you were going to be married to this person for forever, so you just have to deal with it. And I think that's part of it. But so many faith systems are steeped in the patriarchy, right? The men have all the power, the women and children are often voiceless and powerless in that
Mm-hmm.
dynamic. And it makes it really hard to make a change or to see a forward movement when the people without power are never allowed to voice what they're experiencing.
Yeah, because I think, and I hate using the word assumption. Like I don't like using assuming, but I don't know how to phrase this, but I assume, and we assume that you can go to the leader of the church or the temple or the synagogue or whatever and be able to get that support that you need, right? Like And what are your findings about that? Like, what is this like? Is there any, like, that's where I go or other people would go, right? It'd be one of the sources of support, right?
Right. You hope that your faith community, whatever that is for you, will be a supportive entity in your time of need,
Mm-hmm.
right? If you had cancer, if you were sick, if you broke your leg, if you had a bad car
Mm-hmm.
accident, you would hope that community would come around you. Well, what I have experienced and what so many other survivors have experienced is when it comes to domestic violence, that community just isn't there for you in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to be bothered with it. They don't know how to respond to it. They just want you to maintain the peace. And what happens when you try to maintain the peace with an abusive person? You lose, right? Because you're never allowed to say, hey, this is what's going on with me. This is what I need. You just have to give in to the more powerful person in the relationship dynamic. And for me and for so many others, that's women with male perpetrators, but let's acknowledge it can be reversed or even happen in same gender relationships.
Mm-hmm. Do you, I lost my train of thought there, but um, are any time, because abusers are very good at what they do the actual community or the leaders or the reverends or whoever, do they ever get fearful of them as well?
I think they should
Yeah.
be because we know that bystanders are injured in 10 to 20%
Mm,
of domestic violence cases or domestic violence homicide cases, right? Police, medical, and faith leaders, your neighbors, can
yeah.
all be people who are bystanders in these situations. So I think being ignorant or willfully unlearned on the topic of domestic violence perpetration is not in the best interest of a perpetrator because you have your whole congregation to look out for.
Mm-hmm.
And let me just share a personal example
Mm-hmm.
for that talks about that more. So we were not allowed to attend church for much of the relationship, the second marriage. I'll just mostly speak about that one because it lasted for so long. And um, that in and of itself is spiritual abuse, right? When a perpetrator does not allow a person to practice their faith. But we did eventually land in this little rural country church that was mostly elderly and homeschooling individuals. So I guess he felt it was less threatening
Mm-hmm.
in this case. So he allowed us to go on occasion without him. But one Sunday he went with us. He was upset about something the pastor said and literally stood up in the middle of the sermon and yelled at the pastor in front of the entire congregation, right? So these are the bystanders who are being injured by the
Mm-hmm.
abuse that is perpetrated by this abusive individual, this toxic person. No one in the church knew how to handle domestic violence. None of the church leadership did. And what happened is that in order to protect the congregation, I suppose, is how they would phrase this, they kicked us out of the church, right? So that does, in effect, have some value to the rest of the congregation. But after witnessing that and thinking, oh, this person is dangerous, we do not want him back, dangerous enough that they would post an armed guard at the door and make sure we would never return. None of them, none of the church leadership ever reached out to me or the kids, a couple of whom were adults at the time, to check on us. None of them ever reached out to say, does he act that way at home? Are you safe?
Mm-hmm.
And that is the problem when you have faith leaders who are not um, educated and aware about the topic of domestic violence. So you protect the few in your congregation. That's admirable. But you are sending that family home to have further perpetration of abuse without ever connecting them to a resource or asking if they're okay.
Is this
That's
story
problematic.
more is this story more common than I think? Like, this is your story, but you're doing research on this,
Yes.
uh so this is why this topic needs to come up more and more and get educated. Is there reasons, are they educated about, this in their seminaries or in schooling when they get there? No. Okay.
Unfortunately not. So I did a survey during my master's degrees that went out, and 349 faith leaders responded. And these are like actual pastors or priests or also lay leaders, right? So your deacons, your Sunday school teachers, your small group leaders. And I asked, what kind of training they received on the topic of domestic
Hmm.
violence. It was pretty minuscule. And of people who had significant training, I think only one person had significant training out of that whole entire sample. Some had it mentioned in a class, or maybe they attended a conference or read a book or watched a video on the topic, but it was generally pretty minimal over time. And in my own in my own seminary training, domestic violence was 1 hour of one class, and it was an elective. So you have to opt in to the class to even get that conversation about domestic violence. So it's definitely not talked about enough.
So I guess they don't know how to support at all. Do they even know like the umbrella of domestic violence? Like, we've talked about that last time, right? Like there's a huge umbrella what is involved with domestic violence. So they have no understanding if they're not being like if they're not educating them at the seminary, then or wherever they're going to go, then they're not going to know the big picture of what domestic violence can look like.
Right. And that is part of the issue is when I asked how they define domestic violence, they understood that physical
Mm-hmm.
assault was domestic violence. Most of them understood sexual assault to be domestic violence. Fewer understood the verbal, the emotional, and what really surprised me, the spiritual abuse. That faith
Mm-hmm.
leaders did not connect the spiritual abuse to being part of domestic violence.
That's a bit shocking.
Yeah, yeah, I thought so too. So I'll define spiritual abuse
Yeah.
for anyone listening who may be less familiar with it. It's that emotional abuse that occurs when someone uses religious or spiritual beliefs to control another person. So that could be either forcing something on that person
Mm-hmm.
or preventing the person from accessing their own faith. So it might be forcing a particular kind of faith or preventing someone from going to church services. And that, again, could be your perpetrator, or it could be your faith system who's maybe using sacred texts against you by saying, well, this text says that you have to stay
Mm-hmm.
in the marriage, or this text says that you must be to blame.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that many, like in your research, are staying in the marriages because of faith?
I do think it keeps them in there longer.
Okay.
So, the typical statistic that we hear in domestic violence advocate spaces is that the average victim tries to leave 7 times before leaving for good. In one research article, someone had pinned it at 9 times
Mm.
for a survivor of faith.
So it tends to be, as research, like the one research study, it tends to be harder. Can you give us some more reasons on why it is harder?
Like, harder to leave.
Yeah, harder to leave.
I think that a lot of it comes down to that guilt, that you somehow, as a person of faith, have this duty to hold it all together, that
Mm-hmm.
you are somehow this um, voice of reason in your spouse's head. But when you think about it, that's not a human's job, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if you have a faith system, that's the job, so to speak, of the divine power in the
Mm-hmm.
faith system, not
Mm-hmm.
the survivor in the relationship. I think hope factors into that so much, right? So you can think about someone who is experiencing domestic abuse. Let's say in this case, it's a man who's experiencing abuse his wife, and he reaches out to the pastor and she says she's going to do better. And he's like, okay, we're going to keep going. And it falls apart in the next year. And he's does the same thing, reaches out again for help, maybe to a counselor. And she's like, okay, I've got this. I'm going to change. And so he stays in and he keeps trying because what I'm hearing from men is that there's a lot of shame in saying that your wife abuses you,
Hmm.
or for a larger framed male to say, I'm being even physically abused by a
Hmm.
smaller framed
Hmm.
female. And of course, if we flip those genders, how many women hope that their husband will eventually see the light and account for his wrongs, be accountable to somebody, get the healing and the help that he needs, and that the marriage will be what they dreamed it would be.
Yeah, that's that cycle of abuse, right? That trauma bond, right? Where you get a bit of hope. Okay, they're really good this week or this last, the priest talked to them and they're doing very, very well now, and then back to the abuse and the cycle patterns continue, and it's a really awful situation to be in.
Yeah.
So what can advocates or people that are in it, what can they do? Like, is there, can you like, it's not that easy. So I talked to somebody else about this. It's not just easy to leave a community that you love, right? Like
Right.
that community of your church you love, or your whatever faith you are here, you love the people, you've gotten to get to know them, but would it be best for some to, if they're not getting the support there, or they're feeling, stigmatized or shamed, would it be best for them to leave, like to try to go to a different place?
You can always try.
Yeah.
I was engaged with a focus group of individuals who are participating in my survey last night. And what I heard from one of the individuals is that she's tried several churches
Mm.
and none of them have been helpful. And I hear that a lot. That's been my
Wow.
own story too, is one isn't helpful, so you try another one, and maybe they're helpful at first, and then they realize um, that this is a case where you have to be and stay highly involved, right? You can't just
Hmm.
um, ignore the person going through all this pain. When you support someone who is a survivor of domestic violence, particularly when there's children involved, you're supporting that person for the long haul, right? You need to walk alongside them, maybe through court cases, maybe through um, going through some poverty or some difficulties in their life. When a survivor has a child who ends up with cancer or has some other needs, you need to be there to support them. Single parenting is hard work, and the church or the congregation, the synagogue, they should be coming alongside, because isn't that what our faith calls us to do, is to come
Hmm.
alongside those who need help? And yet too many churches, I think, are like, that's too much for us.
Hmm.
We're not able to do that. And that's really unfortunate, because if your faith community cannot be there for you, who is going to be?
I was actually very disappointed when you said that, you know because I a lot of these people are going through so much,
Mhm.
and then they're going trying to find more community, and they're being rejected, and
Yes.
that's makes me really, it makes me angry as well, right?
It's really sad. I 100% agree with you. As I read through the comments of the people in my research, it breaks my heart every day
Yeah.
when I look at how much they are not just harmed from the abuse, but then they end up with this secondary cycle of trauma from their
Hmm.
support
Yeah.
community.
And we haven't even talked about the children,
Right.
right? Like the effects on the children, like the systems of abuse goes down to the children, and they're we're all innocent victims, but they're really, right?
Yeah.
So the church comes, or the faith, like we support everybody, but you're what happens to the children is very affecting.
Oh, absolutely. And if they see a faith system who does not support them in their time of need, they're not going to need that faith system, because they're going to like, well, why should I
Hmm.
be a part of this system who further traumatizes my family?
Yeah, I mean, that's only natural,
Yes.
right? Or they go try out a different type of faith, or who knows where they go, right? Sometimes it's not always good places they choose, right?
Right. Because maybe the help they get is from a corner that's not as helpful as it should be.
Hmm.
Right? We know that a lot of survivors self-medicate in certain ways,
Yeah.
right? Because that's how they cope, and that's not to denigrate them in any way, shape, or form, because everybody copes differently. But when your faith community steps aside rather than being there for you and isn't there for your
Mm-hmm.
kids. And then maybe your kid does make a poor choice, and what happens to the faith community at that point? Well, then they're really hands off. Rather than stepping in and saying, "How can I help you?" They're like, "Oh, we're going to wash our hands of this."
So are you like with your work that you're doing, is there change is going to come? Like do you have some positivity that with you being advocates, advocating for this type of like to get it more educated into the churches, into the other faiths, like to get it like with awareness comes more understanding with more like do you have hope for that?
I do have hope. I um, was pursuing the PhD because I see research as advocacy,
Mm-hmm.
right? If we can get some data behind us, then we can use that to inform our future.
Mm-hmm.
And that was my thought. So I do have some hope that there are some resources out there or that people will connect. When I talk to churches, I tell them to connect to the local family violence shelter in your community. When I talk to social workers and counselors, I'm telling them if you're a part of a faith community, talk to the faith leaders about their response to domestic violence. Very few churches have policy regarding domestic violence. We know that the education is lacking.
Mm-hmm.
So I've tried to put out some resources. I have a website with resources. I had a book published this year. In fact, that's this right here, Taking It Seriously. This is just a succinct, easy to read guide for faith leaders based on my research and my experience and my conversations with hundreds of survivors. Like, this is what I believe faith leaders need to know. And I put in the book what I believe would help them respond best to someone uh, experiencing domestic violence in their own faith community. And then at the end of it, I have something that's rather unique. It is a glossary of domestic violence terms specifically written for faith leaders, because if a survivor comes in and says, "I'm experienced post-separation abuse," are they going to understand what that is? Probably not,
Yeah.
but they could run to the glossary and say, "Okay, let me educate myself about this." I also talk about, like premarital
Mm-hmm.
counseling, and provide them some resources myself so that they can get more training. um, Obviously, there's a cost on the book because it's published, and publisher sets those costs. It's available on Amazon and takingitseriously.com. The book's title website has more resources. There's some free resources on there. I just am trying to get the word out in
Mm-hmm.
any way I can, because if we can increase even slightly the knowledge and awareness of our faith leaders, I think they will seek out additional learning and
Mm-hmm.
additional education on this topic as they're presented with the situation. But how many people are sitting in our pews? We know that incidence of domestic violence in the church is the same as outside the church.
Mm-hmm.
So how many people sitting in our pews are affected by domestic violence, but they're not talking about it because they don't feel it's safe to do so?
Yeah, which again makes me sad, but a lot of us do that anyways, right? Like it's a pretty quiet, shameful thing in the first place. It's just this whole conversation has kind of made me sad, but I'm glad you have hope, which gives me some hope. I know systems are slow to change,
They
right? Like I
are.
know
They
we
are.
know they are, but with your work and getting the word out there, um, let's just hope that it starts changing because it comes from survivors who want to try to make a change. And that's what you're doing so well.
I do think there's hope. And I think as we see a slight change, like you said, systems are really slow to change, but that's the area I like working in,
Mm-hmm.
kind of that systems level
Mm-hmm.
work. I'm a macro social
Mm-hmm.
worker, so I like to look at like, hey, what are our policies?
Mm-hmm.
What do we do at that systems level to try to make changes that will trickle down for people over time? But it's also from grassroots, like you mentioned, survivors
Mm-hmm.
who are willing to speak up, willing to go to their faith leaders and say, this is my experience. will you help me? And if you need education, I'm willing to point you to the right resources. And
Hmm.
pastors who are willing to reach out to the domestic violence shelters, and priests who are willing to talk to social workers. It's it's the community connections, that bridge building in communities that really will make that
And it,
difference.
and the more support anybody has when they're going through this, the better they do, right?
Absolutely.
So that's really, really important. So I'm going to just finish off with last question. Like, so say someone's watching this and they're in the faith and they're dealing with domestic violence. What would you tell them to do? Like, you have some great resources with your, your podcasts. Anything else that you want to mention?
Um, Besides the book and that website, Hope, Rise, Thrive
Mm-hmm.
on social media and on the web has more resources. If people need to point their faith leader
Mm-hmm.
somewhere, that would be helpful. Like you mentioned, the podcast is on there. I just have one season right now, but it talks about survivors and resilience
Mm-hmm.
and how the church factors into that, which I think is really interesting. And it is also a great place to point faith leaders, right? Let's
Mm-hmm.
talk about how survivors experience resilience and how what the church can do to improve that outcome, right? And also, if somebody's listening and they want to participate in my current
Mm-hmm.
research study, I am looking at how the church responds to domestic violence. Does that faith community respond with courage, or does it respond with betrayal? So if anyone gets in touch with you and you want to put them in touch with me, I am still looking for more participants who would
Mm-hmm.
like to participate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll put it in the show notes as well. One quick more last question. Have you found, I just thought of this at the top of my head, but have you
Mhm.
found that when you go to the leader, the reverend, the priest, whatever, to discuss this and say, you know what, what's the feedback do they get? Like, is it safe to do that in general, to go to them, like the leader of the church, and say, I'm experiencing this? Is that a good thing for them to do?
I think it depends.
Okay.
I would not just advocate for anybody and everybody to go to their faith leader and say that just
Okay.
because so many of the responses are negative.
Okay.
It might be helpful to say, what resources do you have available on the topic of domestic violence? If I think
Okay.
that's what I'm experiencing, maybe like test the waters, so to
Okay.
speak.
Okay.
Maybe look for the person in the faith community who has some education, maybe a counselor, a social worker, a
Mm-hmm.
physician, somebody who maybe has connections to resources, the church secretary
Okay.
might have resources, right? So a lot of times if you call the church office and you're like, hey, I need to know where the location of the food pantry is, they'll
Mm-hmm.
point you that direction, right? So the church secretary might have some resources for people who call, because we know that people call the church who don't go to the church,
Right.
right?
Yeah, yeah, that's
So
true.
even people in the community who don't attend a church see the church as a helpful entity in a time of
Hmm.
need.
Hmm. Yeah,
Uh,
it's true, true. So feel it out first then.
I would,
Okay.
because I would hate for somebody to just share from the depths of their heart and hear a disastrous
Yeah.
response,
Hmm.
because that will not be helpful. Of course, if you have a really good relationship with any person in your church or your congregation, your synagogue, who you believe will be helpful, absolutely share with that person.
Okay.
Um, but I also just unfortunately, based on the research that I've done, I do offer a caution. Like, not every
Hmm.
church is educated, not every church has a positive response, but we do want to improve that.
Hmm.
So, if you are willing to share a resource with your faith community, if you are willing to connect bridges in your community,
Hmm.
then by all means, if you have the bandwidth to do that, do it. But some survivors have just been so beaten down
Yeah.
over time, or because of the way their spouse is treating them, or because the relationship in their faith community has been
Hmm.
injured by the spouse. How many times has the toxic spouse kind of like spread untrue
Hmm.
gossip
Hmm. There's
about the
divorce
victim,
abuse. Yep.
right?
Hmm. Yeah.
And that doesn't help when you're trying to get assistance from people you've already been villainized to.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I'd love to keep talking about this. I know we're coming back in January for another some more great because this is such important information and it's so well needed because yeah, it's just a very it's sad, and I think what your work is doing is wonderful and keep going and we'll keep advocating. So anything
Thank
else you'd
you.
like to say before we end today?
I just want to thank you for the work you're doing. The more awareness we spread throughout the world, the better it's going to be. But it's a lot of work and it takes a village. So thank
It takes
you.
a village. Anyways, thank you. Thank you everybody and we'll see you soon.
Okay.
Take
Thank
care.
you so
Bye
much.
bye.